What is a perfect life? For some, it's a luxurious house with a pool, expensive cars, and vacations on exotic islands. But for me, a perfect life is waking up in the morning to the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the laughter of my son coming from the kitchen. It's seeing Maria, my wife, sitting at the table in her favorite blue pajamas, her slightly tousled hair, poring over the week's shopping list. She always wrote everything in a notebook, old worn, but as she called it, lucky. Jack, our son, ran around with his favorite toy airplane in hand. His laughter, loud and carefree, filled our home with such warmth that I often found myself thinking, how lucky am I to be here? Every day of ours was simple, but there was beauty in that simplicity. I woke up a bit earlier to prepare breakfast for everyone. Maria always joked that I was the best chef among bankers. Jack demanded pancakes shaped like animals, and I happily made him a little elephant or a giraffe. His eyes sparkled with joy when he saw his edible friends. When I left for work, Maria waved at me from the porch, and Jack held his toy plane, waving me off with it. This moment had become a ritual for me, a daily reminder of what I was working for. In the evenings, I rushed home. Opening the door to hear Jack shouting, "Dad's here," was my favorite moment. He would run to me and hug me so tightly that I could barely breathe, but it was the best feeling in the world. And Maria, standing in the kitchen doorway, smiling at me, made me feel like the happiest man alive. Our weekends were even better. We always found time for walks in the park. Jack rode his bike while Maria and I walked hand in hand. We often talked about our future, about Jack growing up, the school we'd send him to, and our dream of traveling to Italy as a family when he was a bit older. Sometimes, in the evenings after Jack was asleep, Maria and I would sit on the couch, drink wine, and watch old movies. She loved resting her head on my shoulder and saying, "Aren't we the happiest people in the world?" And I would always reply, "Yes, we truly are." I remember every little detail of our life together. Jack learning to walk, saying his first word, and us decorating the Christmas tree as a family. These were the moments etched into my memory, pieces of a perfect picture. I thought nothing could disrupt this harmonious world. But, as life often has its plans, sometimes even the brightest pictures hide cracks invisible at first glance. I love them with all my heart, and perhaps that's why I couldn't even imagine that one day I'd discover a truth that would make me question everything I believed was real. I still remember the day I first felt that something was wrong. It was an ordinary evening, like hundreds before it. We were having dinner as a family. Jack was talking about his new toys, and I joked that he had already surpassed me in puzzle solving. Maria sat across from me, but her gaze was elsewhere. Her eyes were fixed on her phone lying at the edge of the table. She smiled, but that smile wasn't for us. It was different. "Maria, are you listening?" I asked. She looked up, as if snapping out of deep thoughts, and quickly said, "Yes, of course." "What were you saying?" I didn't suspect anything at the time. I just thought she was tired. We all get distracted sometimes. But that was just the beginning. A few days later, I noticed again how often she was distracted by her phone. Every time it rang or a message came in, she quickly grabbed it and left the room. At first, I thought it was work-related. She had always been responsible and diligent, even outside work. But these calls became too frequent, and her behavior increasingly unusual. One evening, as we sat on the couch after Jack had gone to bed, I noticed Maria engrossed in her phone again. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen, and a mysterious smile appeared on her face, one I hadn't seen before. I joked, "What's so interesting?" She flinched like a schoolgirl caught misbehaving and said, "Oh, nothing, just work emails." She quickly placed the phone face down, and for some reason, that small detail stuck in my memory. She had never done that before. We always shared everything, and her phone often lay open on the table while we watched movies or talked. Then there were more small changes. She started coming home later than usual. Stayed late at the office, she'd say, tossing her coat onto a chair and heading to the kitchen for water. Previously, she always called me if she was running late, but now, she simply sent a brief message, running late. Don't wait for dinner. Those words felt cold, distant, not like the Maria I knew. I tried convincing myself that everything was fine. Everyone goes through tough periods. Work, stress, fatigue, it could all explain her behavior. But over time, I began noticing more details that didn't fit the usual picture. One day, while doing laundry, I found a scrap of paper in her coat pocket with a phone number written on it. I didn't know whose number it was, and I didn't ask her. I wanted to believe it was something insignificant, but I felt something shifting in my heart. That nagging feeling I tried to suppress was growing stronger. Moreover, she began avoiding conversations. If before we could spend hours talking about everything, from how her day went to weekend plans, now she responded briefly, without emotion. Her gaze often wandered, and I noticed how she seemed to avoid eye contact with me. At first, I thought it was just stress. I told myself, trying to find an explanation. But deep down, another thought was brewing. Something told me it wasn't work or fatigue. I couldn't pinpoint what it was, her glance, her tone, or just my intuition. But this change, small at first glance, became a warning sign for me. Little did I know it was just the beginning. It was a normal evening, or so I thought. Jack was already asleep, and the house was enveloped in silence. I sat on the couch, scrolling through the news on my tablet, occasionally glancing at Maria, who was sitting in the chair opposite me. She held her phone in her hands, but this time, her face looked tense. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen, as if she was deeply absorbed in something very important. At first, I didn't pay much attention. We all get lost in our phones sometimes, right? But this was different. Something strange. Her expression didn't match what I was used to seeing. Usually, when she received messages from friends or colleagues, she'd laugh or respond playfully. But this time, there was no laughter, just a shadow of worry in her eyes. She was sitting slightly turned away from me, and I could see her phone screen glowing in her hands. Suddenly, her fingers froze, and she stopped, staring at the screen. I didn't know what she was looking at, but her reaction made me tense up. I even heard her sigh softly, as if what she read had knocked the wind out of her. "Maria, is everything okay?" I asked, trying to sound calm. She flinched like someone caught off guard. "Yes, everything's fine," she replied quickly, almost too quickly, and placed her phone face down on the armrest of the chair. Her face seemed a bit paler than usual. That surprised me. Why was she suddenly so nervous? Why was her behavior so unusual? I tried not to dwell on it. She stood up and said she wanted to get a glass of water. As soon as she disappeared into the kitchen, my eyes fell on her phone. I saw the screen light up with a new message. I didn't intend to look at her phone. It was wrong, and I had always respected her privacy. But something inside me, something stronger than myself, pushed me toward it. I slowly approached the chair, as if afraid she might return at any moment. Her phone lay screen up, and the message was visible even without unlocking it. "We can't keep hiding the truth." Those words hit me like a bolt of lightning. Everything inside me froze. I reread them again, as if trying to make sure I understood correctly. Hiding the truth? What truth? These questions started echoing in my head like hammer blows. I immediately wanted to find out who sent it and what it meant. My eyes shifted to the sender's name, but there was only one word: unknown. It gave me no clues, only amplified my anxiety. My hands were trembling. I didn't know what to do. Did I have the right to unlock her phone and see what they were writing about? Did I have the right to invade her privacy? My mind was torn in two. One part screamed, "Don't do this. It's her phone, her business," while the other insisted, "You have the right to know. This concerns you and your life." I heard water splashing in the kitchen. Maria was still there. I had only a few seconds to decide. In the end, I stepped back and sat down on the couch. The phone remained on the chair, and I sat there, staring at it as if it were a bomb ready to explode at any moment. When Maria returned, she looked calm, as if nothing had happened. She picked up the phone and smiled at me again with that forced smile I had begun to despise. That night, I hardly slept. Those words, "We can't keep hiding the truth," kept replaying in my head over and over. What did they mean? What were they hiding? And most importantly, why hadn't she told me the truth herself? I lay in the dark, listening to her steady breathing, and felt my trust in her beginning to crack. That message was just a few words, but they changed everything. After that night, I couldn't live as I had before. Every morning when I woke up, my first thought wasn't about work, my son, or even Maria. It was the question tearing me apart from the inside. What is she hiding from me? I tried convincing myself it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe it was work-related, maybe even a silly joke. But I knew I was lying to myself. Her behavior gave me no peace. And the worst part was that she had become even more cautious. Her phone was always with her. She no longer left it unattended, even when she went to the kitchen or bathroom. Previously, she would leave it on the table during dinner, but now it stayed in her pocket or bag, as if it were some treasure she was afraid of losing. I couldn't wait any longer. I needed to know the truth. One evening, after Maria fell asleep, I quietly got out of bed. Her phone lay on the nightstand, but now it was protected by a password. I tried a few combinations, but all were futile. She had changed the password, and this only confirmed my suspicions. The next day, I made a decision. I downloaded a tracking app. It was a program capable of tracking location, calls, and even messages. I knew it was wrong. Every fiber of my being screamed that this was an invasion of her privacy, but I couldn't stop. I had to know what was going on. I felt guilty, but that guilt paled in comparison to the feeling I had when I looked into her eyes and realized she was lying. For the first time in a long while, I began an investigation. The first few days, nothing suspicious came up. She went to work, met with colleagues, visited the usual places. I was beginning to think I was overreacting. Maybe she was just busy. But on the third day, everything changed. Maria said she was going to meet a client in a neighboring town. This didn't seem odd to me since her job often required travel. But in the evening, when I checked the app, I noticed she wasn't in the town she mentioned. Her phone showed a location near a small hotel just a few miles from our home. I felt my heart stop. Why was she there? It could have been a coincidence, a mistake. But something inside me told me it wasn't. I decided to act. I got into my car and drove to the hotel. It was a small, modest building with a few floors. When I pulled into the parking lot, I saw her car. It was parked at the very edge, far from the main entrance, as if someone had deliberately tried not to draw attention. I sat in my car, unable to force myself to get out. What would I say if I saw her? How would I explain why I was there? At that moment, I saw her exiting the hotel. She was alone. Her hair was slightly disheveled, and she was holding a small black bag in her hands. She quickly walked to her car, got in, and drove off. I didn't follow her. I just sat there, watching as her car disappeared into the distance. Conflicting emotions consumed me. What was she doing at that hotel? Why did she lie to me? And who was with her? That night, I barely slept again. When she returned home, her behavior was normal, as if nothing had happened. But suspicion boiled inside me. The next day, I opened the app again. I checked her messages and saw several new ones from an unknown number. Thank you for yesterday. You were amazing. When can we meet again? I no longer needed to guess. My fears were confirmed. But instead of stopping, I felt a burning need to know more. Who was this man? What did he mean to her? I didn't know where this would lead, but I couldn't stop now. When I saw on the app that Maria was back at the same hotel where I'd seen her before, my stomach churned. I was sitting in my car near our house, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers turned white. I knew I had to find out what was happening. This time, I wasn't just going to sit and watch. The drive to the hotel felt endless. Every turn brought waves of doubt. What am I doing? Do I really want to know the truth? What if it destroys everything we've built? But each time, I forced myself to keep going. I had to see it with my own eyes. The hotel looked ordinary, a small building with an almost empty parking lot. But that's what made it so unsettling. This wasn't a place for business meetings or family vacations. It seemed designed for secrets. I parked a little further away from the entrance, and turned off the engine. I sat in the dark, watching the doors. A storm raged in my heart. Time seemed to stand still. Every minute dragged on like an eternity. After a few minutes, the hotel doors opened. Maria walked out. She looked different. Her hair was slightly disheveled, as if she had nervously run her hands through it. Her shoulders were tense, and her face looked unsettled. She was holding a small black bag, and somehow, that detail felt the most troubling. I couldn't move. I watched her get into her car and drive away, leaving me behind in the growing darkness of the parking lot. I sat there, consumed by questions. What was she doing at this hotel? Why did she lie to me? Who was she meeting? That night, I knew the truth wouldn't wait much longer. And whatever it would change everything. I froze. My heart pounded so loudly it felt like it echoed in the car. I wanted to rush out and confront her right then and there. But I couldn't. I stood in the darkness, watching her leave. She walked to her car, opened the door, and got in. Her movements were nervous, as if she feared someone might be watching her. The irony was that someone was. I couldn't take my eyes off her. My thoughts swirled into chaos. Who was with her in that hotel? What happened inside? Why does she look like this? As her car engine started and she drove away, I stayed frozen. I was paralyzed by a mix of despair and helplessness. What was I supposed to do? Chase her? Stop her and demand answers? But was I even ready to hear what she might say? I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel as if it were the last anchor in a sea of emotions. My entire world felt like it had flipped upside down. The picture of our perfect life had suddenly shattered into 1,000 tiny pieces I couldn't put back together. My heart ached, but I couldn't bring myself to confront her. I closed my eyes and tried to steady my breathing. But every breath felt heavier than the last. I felt as if I were standing on the edge of an abyss. That night, I returned home, but I was no longer the same person I had been before. The entire drive back, I convinced myself that nothing was lost yet, that this might all be a misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning of something that would destroy my life. When I walked into the house that evening, Maria was sitting in the living room. The light was dim, and there was a half-finished cup of tea on the table in front of her. She looked tired, even a little worn out, but not in the way someone looks after a hard day at work. It was the exhaustion of someone carrying something heavy and burdensome, something eating away at her from the inside. Maria, I began, trying to keep my voice as calm as possible, even though I was burning inside. She looked up at me, and in her eyes, I saw worry. "What's wrong?" she asked, trying to sound casual, but her voice betrayed her. "What's going on?" I looked her straight in the eyes. "I want to know the truth. I know you're hiding something from me." Her face froze. For a moment, it seemed like she forgot how to breathe. She lowered her head and began fiddling with the handle of her cup. "What are you talking about?" She tried to deflect, but her voice was weak. "I was at the hotel, Maria. I saw you." My words hit like a hammer. Her head snapped up, her eyes widened, and her lips trembled slightly. She tried to say something, but no words came out. "How long has this been going on?" My hands trembled as I tried to keep my composure, but my voice betrayed me. "It's not what you think," she began, but I interrupted her. "Then tell me what it is." Who is he? What were you doing at that hotel? Her shoulders slumped, and she fell silent. For a few seconds, the room was engulfed in deep silence, broken only by the sound of our breathing. Then she took a deep breath and quietly said, "It happened recently. I didn't want it to, but her voice trailed off. Didn't want it? I exploded. You didn't want it? Then why did it happen, Maria? What are you hiding from me?" She closed her eyes, as if trying to gather her strength. Then her voice came out sharp and cold. "I had an affair." Those words thundered through me like lightning. Everything I felt, everything I was sure of, suddenly vanished. "How could you?" I asked quietly, feeling the air leave my lungs. "How could you do this to me? To us?" She wiped the tears that started streaming down her cheeks. Her hands were shaking, but it didn't matter anymore. "I don't know. It just happened. I was confused, lonely, and lonely." I cut her off. "You're lonely when I give everything to you and our family every day. Lonely when I pour my entire self into us?" She fell silent. Then, like a bolt of lightning, a new wave of anxiety flashed in her eyes. "There's something else," she whispered. "What else?" I was barely holding myself together. What could be worse than this? She was silent for a few seconds that felt like an eternity. Then she quietly said, "I'm not sure Jack is yours." These words shattered me. Everything left of my heart crumbled into tiny fragments. "What did you just say?" I asked so quietly that I barely recognized my voice. "I don't know. I'm not sure." Her voice trembled. "It happened once, but there's a chance that he—" I couldn't listen anymore. I stood up and began pacing the room, trying to process what I had just heard. "Our son? Are you saying that our son might not be mine?" She remained silent, her head bowed, with tears silently streaming down her face. "Do you realize what you just said?" I shouted. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You're sorry?" I laughed bitterly. "That's all you can say?" I had no words left. I simply walked out of the room, leaving her there, surrounded by her lies and tears. That night, after her confession, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark, listening to her steady breathing beside me, but all I could hear were her words. "I'm not sure Jack is yours." Each echo of those words felt like a blow. I thought back to the moment I first held Jack in my arms, how his tiny fingers wrapped around my thumb. I had felt then that it was the happiest moment of my life. But now, that memory was tainted with doubt and pain. The next morning, as soon as Maria left the house, I decided to act. I found a box of medical masks and gloves in the closet. They were necessary to leave no traces. I felt like a thief, even in my own home, but I had no other choice. First, I went to Jack's room. His favorite toy, a little airplane, was lying on the floor. I bent down and noticed a strand of hair on one of its wings. Carefully, I picked it up with tweezers and placed it in a clean plastic bag. My hand trembled as I sealed the zip. Then I went to the bathroom. On his toothbrush, there were a few bristles with dried toothpaste. I took that as well. Everything felt so surreal. What am I doing? Why do I even have to do this? With the samples collected, I sat down on my computer and found the nearest lab offering DNA testing. I filled out the necessary forms and arranged for a courier to pick up the samples. When the box with the materials was ready, I sat holding it for a few more minutes, staring at the printed address of the lab. That small package could change everything about my life. It could mark the beginning of the end. When the courier arrived and took the box, I felt a strange sense of relief. But it lasted only a few seconds. Then came the realization. The hardest part begins now, waiting. Each day felt like an eternity. I woke up every morning, staring at my phone, hoping to see a notification that the results were ready. But every morning, the screen remained blank. I tried to focus on work, but my thoughts kept circling back to one thing. What if it's true? What if Jack isn't mine? These thoughts consumed me day and night. I watched him playing in the yard and kept asking myself, do I see anything of myself in him? Is it possible I've been wrong all these years? Maria acted as if nothing had happened. She even tried to joke and maintain the facade of normalcy. But I couldn't look her in the eyes anymore. Every time she spoke, I felt the walls between us growing higher. One evening, as I read Jack a bedtime story, he suddenly hugged me and whispered, "Daddy, you'll always be my hero." Those words hit me like a punch to the chest. My eyes filled with tears, but I forced myself not to cry in front of him. I simply replied, "And you'll always be my son." But inside, everything screamed, what if it's not true? The days dragged on like years. I avoided any conversations with Maria. All our interactions became cold and mechanical. My mind was consumed by one relentless question. Then, 5 days later, I received a message. "Your results are ready." I stood holding my phone, feeling my heart pound as if it would burst out of my chest. I knew that these few words I was about to read would change everything I thought I knew about myself, my family, and my life forever. It was an ordinary morning. The sun filtered softly through the curtains, flooding the room with gentle light, but it meant nothing to me. I sat at the kitchen table, holding the envelope the courier had delivered just minutes ago. It lay on the table in front of me, small, white, and unremarkable in appearance, but to me, it weighed more than my entire life. My hands trembled as I reached for it. This was the moment I had tried to avoid for days, but now it was here. This envelope was the final drop, the one that would decide whether my life would hold together or shatter into irreparable fragments. I looked at my hands. They were as cold as ice. My fingers struggled to tear open the thin paper. I took several deep breaths, trying to calm myself, but my heart pounded harder than ever. "You have to do this," I told myself, but even those words felt empty. When I finally opened the envelope, the papers slipped onto the table. They were ordinary, with standard laboratory headings and printed graphs. But my eyes immediately found the key sentence. It stood alone, stark in black and white. Probability of paternity, 0%. My heart stopped. I read the sentence again, and again, and again. "This is a mistake," I told myself. "It has to be a mistake." But numbers don't lie. Laboratories don't make mistakes. I sat there with the papers in my hands, unable to breathe. It felt as if the entire world had narrowed down to these few words on a piece of paper. My life, everything I thought I knew, was crumbling before my eyes. Jack, my Jack, he was my world. I remembered teaching him to walk, building sandcastles with him on the beach, reading him bedtime stories, the same ones my father had read to me. He called me Dad, and that was all that had ever mattered to me. But now, that word had become a lie. I crumpled the paper in my hands and threw it on the floor. Then I picked it up again, smoothed it out, and read it once more. Each time, those words hit me harder than the last. I felt anger, pain, and despair building up inside me. Why? How could she? How dare she keep this from me for so many years? I got up from the chair, but my legs felt like jelly. My head was spinning with 100 thoughts. I wanted to run to her, demand answers, scream at her, but at the same time, I felt like I couldn't even form a single word. I glanced toward the child's room. Jack was sitting on the floor, playing with his toy cars. His happy laughter echoed through the house. At that moment, a wave of love and despair washed over me. He doesn't know. He's innocent. I knelt by the doorway to his room, watching him. Tears streamed down my face, but I couldn't let him see me like this. My thoughts were tearing me apart. Could I leave him? Could I admit that he wasn't mine and walk away from everything we had been through together? That day, I sat in the empty house longer than ever before. Every sound felt muted. I could only hear my own breathing and feel the weight of my shattered life pressing down on me. These were the results that changed everything. And now I no longer knew who I was in this house, or what would come next. I sat on the couch in the living room, holding the papers that had broken me. Everything inside me screamed with pain, anger, and despair. These were the days when I didn't understand how to go on living, or even if I had the right to decide what came next. Jack played in his room. His cheerful laughter filled the house. I could hear him talking to his toy cars, telling them where to go, and creating stories only a child's imagination could conjure. That was his world, pure, bright, untouched by doubts or lies. I looked up at the family photo hanging above the fireplace. It showed the three of us, me, Maria, and Jack, all smiling, carefree, and happy. It was an illusion I had believed for so long. But now I knew. I thought about it all night, unable to close my eyes. I replayed every moment I had shared with Jack. How he had first called me Dad. How he had built pillow forts together. How he had begged me to teach him to swim last summer. How he hugged me when he was scared during a thunderstorm and said, "Dad, I'm not afraid when you're here." Those memories felt more real than any words on a piece of paper. The next morning, when I walked into Jack's room, he looked up at me with a wide smile. "Dad, will you help me build a road for my cars?" he asked. A lump formed in my throat. His voice, his smile, everything about him was so genuine that I couldn't imagine my life without him. I sat down next to him and looked into his eyes. "Of course, buddy," I said, trying to hide my emotions. We built the road together, and in those moments I understood one simple truth. This boy was my son. Even if the blood said otherwise, I was his father. I had been there for him from the very beginning. I had taught him to walk, to talk. I had been there when he was sick, when he was happy, and when he cried. My love for him wasn't tied to genetics or tests. He was mine, and I was his dad. But there was another side to this story. I could no longer look at Maria the same way. Her betrayal was a deep wound that would never heal. She had destroyed everything I believed was real. What hurt the most was that she had robbed me of the choice, deceiving me all these years. That evening, I gathered the strength to talk to her. She was sitting in the kitchen, staring into her cup of tea. When she looked up at me as I entered, I saw sadness and fear in her eyes. She knew what this conversation was about. "I'll stay for Jack," I began, trying to keep my voice steady, though everything inside me boiled with anger. "He's innocent. He's my son, and I'll always be there for him." Her eyes filled with tears. "I know. I understand," she whispered. "But I can't live with you," I added, and those words felt like a sentence. "You betrayed me. You destroyed what mattered most in my life. I can't trust you anymore." She covered her face with her hands and began to cry. But I could no longer feel anything for her except cold emptiness. That evening, I started packing my things. I decided to rent an apartment nearby to stay close to Jack. As I carried my suitcase to the car, Jack ran out onto the porch. "Dad, where are you going?" His voice trembled with fear. I knelt in front of him and hugged him tightly. "Buddy, I'll always be here for you. I'll just live somewhere else. But we'll see each other every day. I promise." He started crying, and my heart broke. But I knew this was the only right decision. It was a hard step, but I realized that my love for Jack defined me as a father. Staying with someone who had betrayed me would be wrong, not only for me, but for him as well. The house felt quiet, almost too quiet. I walked through the empty rooms, collecting the last of my belongings. Our home, once filled with laughter, happy moments, and love, now felt foreign, like a stage set after the play had ended. On the kitchen table lay a small piece of paper. I had approached it several times, but couldn't bring myself to write what I needed. It would be my final words to Maria, words that left no room for hope or reconciliation. I sat at the table, holding a pen in my trembling hand. I wrote each word clearly and resolutely. I can live without you, but not without him. Jack will always be my son, and I will always be there for him. But our life together is over. I know this isn't your only secret, but I don't want to be a part of your lies anymore. I left the note on the table, placed the house keys beside it, and paused for a moment. My eyes scanned the kitchen, where we had shared so many warm evenings, and my heart clenched with pain. But this pain was better than the bitter taste of betrayal and deceit that had consumed me in recent days. As I walked out of the house, I glanced one last time into Jack's room. He was asleep, clutching his favorite toy tightly. I couldn't bring myself to wake him, but I quietly said, "I'll always be here, son. Always." When the door closed behind me, I felt a strange sense of peace. It was as if I had finished a long, painful chapter. But something inside me told me that the story wasn't over yet. The message that changed everything. Maria came home a few hours later. She looked hollow, as if she knew something inevitable was about to happen. Walking into the kitchen, she saw the note on the table. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. As she read each word, a coldness spread through her chest. She had known this moment would come, but she never thought it would hurt this much. Clutching the note to her chest, tears streamed down her cheeks, one after another. She sat down at the table, and her phone, lying beside her, lit up. She picked it up and saw a message from the person she had tried to keep in the shadows all these years. "Now you're free. He's gone." Her fingers trembled. The words were simple, but their meaning suddenly became unbearable. She reread them, trying to understand why they filled her with such dread. She didn't reply immediately. Her mind swirled with thoughts. What now? What did this freedom he spoke of mean? Before she could finish her thoughts, another message appeared. "I knew you would choose me. I'm waiting for you where it all began." Maria clutched the phone to her chest and looked around, as if searching for answers among the walls of this house. But there was nowhere to run. She knew this moment would come. She knew every lie had its price. But now that everything was out in the open, she suddenly realized she had lost more than she could have ever imagined.